There were 80 guys, I think,
84.
left. 80 World War I veterans.
Went up there with bodies.
Yeah, and they were on the trip, and I was on the trip, and it may be the last trip for World War II veterans because there's hardly any left. So if there are any World War II veterans among you who haven't been, I just want
There
to...
are 90,000 World War II veterans left in Florida.
Okay. And they're dying at the rate of what, Mickey? 50 a day?
500 a day.
500 a day, yeah. So there aren't too many left. As a matter of fact, we didn't know there were any left here until 3 of us showed up. It's the thrill of a lifetime. Can you imagine that? All that we went through in our lifetime, a day in Palm Isle, a day in South Florida, in your 90s, turns out to be a day that you'll never forget. What happened on this one-day trip, you leave like 6 o'clock in the morning from Palm Beach Airport, and you arrive back at 8:30 in the evening. So it's a one-day trip. You have 2 flights, up and back to Washington and back here, and the things that you see are amazing in the reception you get from the people who are called out to greet you when you arrive at the airport in Washington. People you never knew were going to be there, and they're standing there in the hundreds applauding you and grabbing your hand and welcoming you and telling you that they're thanking you for your service and so on and so forth, and they're making a hero out of you. And these people were shaking my hand and welcoming, congratulations, and I thought of a sentence I used to have to utter very frequently when I was a kid, like 10 years old. I didn't do nothing. I didn't do nothing. They sent me gave me a uniform and put 2 stripes on my arm, and they said, okay, now go to war. So I didn't do nothing, and they were treating me like I had the Congressional Medal of Honor. Absolutely amazing. And then when we come back and land at 8:30 at PBIA, there's another reception, the same way. Hundreds of people and bands and kids and oldsters coming over to me, and they were saying, can you imagine this? They were saying that this is just to prove that nobody's going to forget what you guys did. And it makes you cry. But everybody was crying among the guys who were being celebrated. And if you think I'm fooling or exaggerating, Mickey is here. He was on the trip. Also over here, he was on the trip. Somebody else, Bill, was on the trip. And okay, I didn't know about that. So there you are. There's about 10 or 12 or more guys who have been on this trip. And probably the next trip will be for Korean veterans. You think they will still have another World War II?
Okay.
I saw guys 98 years old. They're not going to get any older than that.
If you live in New Jersey is taking Korean War vets. The state of Florida still has 80,000 World War II vets living in the state of Florida. Everybody moved to the state of Florida. So the next trip in May is full up with World War II. I don't know about September and October, but
Pretty soon, they're
All
going
I
to
can
resort
say
to
is
the Korean
that if you
veterans.
want to go now, move back to New Jersey. Otherwise, we're going to have to wait it out. And one of the problems holding back the Korean vets is the publicity that the Palm Beach Post gave to this. There were guys that never heard about it, World War II vets. The Palm Beach Post gave a lot of publicity to it, and these guys signed up. So unless you lie about your credentials, but don't because they check them up. So anyway, sweat it out and your turn will come.
Today's Palm Beach Post has the story of yesterday's trip, the one I'm telling you about. So you can pick it up and see it in Section B. And if you're a World War II veteran and haven't gone on this trip, you gotta go. And if you're a Korean veteran, keep your eyes open and register to go. That'll be a trip in the next 1 or 2 trips. Anyway, now let me get what we're supposed to be talking about. Thank you very much for listening to that story. Magnifying glass. I screw on all the body parts every morning. Hey, now I was going to... I wanted to read you one more blurb about this book that I didn't read you last week. This is what people have been saying about the Caro books on LBJ. By writing the best presidential biography the country has ever seen, Caro has forever changed the way we think and read American history. Although the amount of research Caro has done for these books is staggering, it's his immense talent as a writer that has made his biography of Johnson out of America's most amazing, one of America's most amazing literary achievements. Caro's chronicle is as absorbing as a political thriller. There's not a wasted word, not a needless anecdote. The series is a masterpiece, unlike any other work of American history published in the past. It's true that there will never be another Lyndon B. Johnson, but there will never be another Robert A. Caro either. And that's from NPR, National Public Radio. Okay, and that's true too. So, now let's see where we might have left off. Okay, I said that one of the things I was going to talk about today was 2 elections. One, that Lyndon Johnson stole an election on the way to becoming president. Not late, but early on in his elective career. It was for a local Texas office. And then another election wherein he was practically, or maybe surely, the single greatest cog in the wheel that elected John F. Kennedy. His campaigning actually, I think, elected John F. Kennedy because he brought back in this election that I'm speaking about now all the Texans who were wooed and won by Eisenhower in 2 elections where Texas voted Republican and had never done so before. Johnson brought them back because Eisenhower was no longer running, and he told them they had to return to the party of their fathers, and they did. They had to win Texas to win that election, and Johnson saw to it that they did. He actually won the election for Kennedy by making sure Texas returned to the Democratic fold, notwithstanding the fact that in the past he was so eager to be elected that he stole the election. Okay, so let me tell you how he did that. He lost the election by 85 votes. It was for a local office. And maybe there were 7,000 people who voted or something like that. And he lost by 85 votes. But he didn't ask for a recount, which would have been the normal thing to do. He went down to the Board of Elections, and he knew the chairman of the board very well. And he convinced him not to have a recount, but to accomplish the same thing, which would still protect his budget for the Board of Elections, in the sense that he won't have to pay people to sit down by hand and recount and so on and so forth. Just leave the machines where they were and have a rerun of the election. And he convinced the guy to do it, one way or another. And they had a rerun of the election, not a recount. And in the couple of days that it took to accomplish this, Johnson campaigned like crazy in the township, and he won the re-election by several hundred votes, getting a lot of people to change their vote, apparently. And he accomplished this. And it's not what the state constitution said, but nobody objected. And it happened, and he won other elections, and he became the President of the United States, in part by stealing an election. And then he made John Kennedy President of the United States, not by stealing an election, but by campaigning in southern states and getting all these Southerners lined up back in the Democratic Party and away from Eisenhower, who was not running at this time. And he did this mainly on this LBJ special train that went through 5 or 6 states in the South, only in small towns along I-95, but on the railroad. And he choreographed these stops and who was making the speech at each stop, and he told his staff what to wear in each place. And at each stop, the back of the train, which served as the platform for the short 20-minute meeting before it moved on to the next small town, the back of the train was where everybody gathered around. He had advanced men going to this area and talking to the local politicos, newspapers, and getting out the crowd. So always there was 30 or 40 or 80 people there, that's all. But they were the interested people in town. They were those interested in politics, and they were politicking. And then when we went back home, later that afternoon, they were politicking some more. And they did this in all these small towns for 2 days, maybe 10 towns in 2 days. And he had it figured out, and he had it accomplished. Other people have done this sort of thing in practically every election, every national election. But it wasn't choreographed the way Lyndon Johnson did. He had the mayor, the judge, any other politicians he could round up. They would come, he told them to dress up in the Sunday go-to-meeting clothes, and the car behind the last car, or the car in front of the last car, when the train was backed up, was a bar car. Well, it wasn't a bar car, but it was turned into a bar car. And these people had a half hour of a cocktail party going on at each stop before they went out to the back and became part of the audience, or part of the 2 or 3 people who made a short speech before Johnson did. At every stop, he got them oiled up in the bar car, and they came out and they really said about politicking. And then he came on, and he was at his best. And in the meantime, when these guys now were in the back of where the meeting was going on, outside the last car, they were cleaning up the bar car, and the guys from the next town, the local politicos, were driving down I-95, and they came a half hour later, and now they were being oiled in the bar car while this was going on. And when Johnson finished his speech, he went back to that other car, and now he was mingling with the big shots from the next town while the train was going to the next town. And he told them what he wanted to hear them say, and they went out and made the speeches in their own hometowns right after they had their cocktail party, and they were politicking and socializing. And as soon as that was over, Johnson was back there with Lady Bird mingling with the people from the following town. And these guys, so there were people getting off this train and people getting on the train and then going through the 2 cars, and that's the way it went in every town, and like clockwork, that's the way it went. And he got everybody ready and willing and able to fight for votes. And they did. Every one of those towns went practically unanimously. Well, they were all southern towns for the Johnson-Kennedy ticket. He did this as the vice presidential nominee. And those 5 states all were southern states that went back from Eisenhower to the Democrats, And that's the way Johnson accomplished it. Practically single-handed. And all the people in the Kennedy camp that poo-pooed Johnson as a dumb old hillbilly, the Irish Mafia and the Harvards, as Johnson called anybody with an education superior to his, which he only found when he got to Washington. He didn't really know anything about the Northeast intellects or the Northeast politicians. Anyway, he won his part of that election for John F. Kennedy. So here's a guy who typified being two kinds of people all through his career. He was a nasty, vengeful, duplicitous individual, but always for the good of the constituents that he represented. He did other things for money, which he shouldn't have done. They were immoral and unethical. But whatever he did, it was to get elected and push forward what turned out to be, especially for a Texan, a liberal attitude and liberal legislation. And when he finally became president some years later, he did all the things that JFK talked about but could never get done. Johnson did. So even when he was doing evil things, he was doing them for a good reason. So here's a guy who, in everything he did, he was a double personality. He was a nasty guy. He was a bossy guy. He was a big, garrulous hillbilly. He was a very bright, big, garrulous hillbilly. And he was a guy who was a do-gooder at heart. And a thief. There was nobody like him. And people, even today, don't realize that. They either like him or they hate him, but they don't know he was really two people. He was a good guy and a bad guy. And from where I sit, you can't come down on one side or the other. He was both. And this, what I just told you about those two elections, is just one example of it. He was this way all through. And he was also bothered greatly by his inferiority complex, as most big superior guys have an inferiority complex. That's why they're acting superior in the first place. And when he was ever, what's the word that bothered him the most? Somebody said it, I thought I heard. Whenever he was distressed or in a bad mood, sometimes he had a bad mood that lasted several weeks, depression and things like that. His inferiority complex showed, if you knew his personality, you realized that that's what it was. He knew he went to college. But he went to a dinky little college. I talked about this before. It was a teacher's college. And then when he got to Washington, he was exposed to people with the strangest accents. And they thought he had the strangest accent. And he was very different. And he hardly understood what the hell they were talking about when they flaunted their Boston accent and the King's English from Harvard. He was out of his element altogether. And they knew it, and they looked down their nose at him, and he knew it, and that depressed him very much. And that's the way they lived together. Okay, so he was a guy with a split personality all the way through. Now, let's see where we are here. I'll just start where I have the line that says start. I don't even know what we're going to talk about, but I know I planned it. The other problem required a lot of phone calls, and delicate ones, since they involved a figure from Johnson's past, whom he had been hoping to keep in the past, George Parr. George Berthan Parr of Duval County in the Rio Grande Valley, the legendary Duke of Duval, the most powerful of the despotic patrones of jefes. What's patrones of jefes? Spanish. Patrons of the what? Jefe? What is that? Anyway,
Party boss.
these were Mexican big shots. These were Texas big shots, many of them of Mexican birth.
The chief patron.
What dear?
The chief, Hefe is chief.
Ah, okay, the chief patron of the Democratic parties. Right, that's what they were. Thank you, Barbara. That's why Barbara's here. Now, Parr, the chief of them, could produce a lot of votes for Johnson. He had, in fact, done it in 1948, when late on election night, with Johnson still far behind Coke Stevenson, not Governor Stevenson, Coke Stevenson, the two counties that the Duke controlled personally, Duval and Starr, and other valley counties controlled by the Duke's satraps, suddenly produced 20,000 new votes for Johnson. The vote in Duval was 4,195 votes for Johnson, 38 for Stevenson. How do you like that margin? Of Stevenson, of more than 100 to 1 of the victory. And 6 days later, with all, this is the election that he stole. 6 days later, a margin of more than 100 to 1. And 6 days later, with all the late returns supposedly counted, and Johnson still behind by a few votes, a Parr-controlled precinct in adjoining Jim Wells County suddenly announced that its returns had somehow not been counted. And the 200 new votes for Johnson from this precinct, votes cast by people who had all written their names in the same ink, in the same handwriting, and who had voted in alphabetical order, gave Johnson the lead in an election he won by 87 votes. With Parr still in power, still able to produce what was needed if he wanted to, Johnson had to make sure he wanted to. So these people, it was so obvious because of the evidence that they all voted in alphabetical order, the way their names was on the polls, and they all voted with the same ink and the same handwriting, and still nobody complained, and Johnson won the election. Okay, that's the same one I was talking about. Now, let's move along here. This part of the chapter is called The Backstairs. It's called The Backstairs for this reason. It takes place in the hotel in Dallas where the Democratic National Convention was being held, and where John Kennedy had just won over John Kennedy had just won over, no, he just won over,
Lodge.
who's the guy I'm talking about?
Nixon.
Lodge.
No.
Johnson.
I'm talking about
The Democrat.
the Democratic vice presidential candidate was who?
Johnson.
Okay.
Adlai Stevenson.
I'm talking about LBJ.
Stevenson?
Johnson, Kennedy won the Democratic...
Symington.
No, I'm talking about LBJ. Kennedy beat LBJ for the presidential nomination. That's the race I'm talking about. Kennedy beat LBJ for the nomination.
Who they were considering for vice.
And now we're talking about choosing the vice presidential candidate. And everybody, well, there was Symington and a whole bunch of others, Stevenson and Humphrey and all these Northerners and all the Boston people who were part of John F. Kennedy's entourage and kitchen cabinet, so to speak. All of these people were adamantly against even considering Johnson to be a vice presidential candidate. And Bobby Kennedy was frantically lobbying against that because he hated Johnson and Johnson hated him back, and everything was against it. And on top of that, everybody thought that if they ever gave Johnson any consideration, he wouldn't accept it because he had the powerful job of the head of the Senate, where he had power, and the vice president has no power. He wouldn't accept that, except they didn't know that Johnson had an ambition to be president of the United States since he was 11 years old. When his father took him to Austin to see how the Texas Parliament, which his father was a member of, a senator, state senator, and he wanted to be just like his father at that time and be a politician. And the chief politician was the president. And he wanted to be president every day since he was 11 years old. But he didn't say that very often, but it was known among his friends anyway. So, where were we here? So now Kennedy finally said to his men, watch out, you're talking about my partner, my nominee for the vice presidency. From now on, you change your mind, everybody, about Johnson, because I'm going to ask him to be on the ticket with me. And that, including Bobby Kennedy and all the other Irishmen, part of JFK's entourage, they did what they were told. They stopped in public castigating Johnson, the big hillbilly, but now they did it in private. And one day, in the convention period, the name of this I said was the back stairs. Well, Kennedy's suite was a couple of floors above in the same row of the hotel, for a couple of floors above the Johnson suite. And so when Bobby Kennedy had something nasty to say, he ran down those stairs, knocked on the door, and asked Lady Bird if he could talk to Johnson, and if she couldn't dissuade him, they had an argument, and then they went their separate ways. Well, one day, John F. Kennedy calls, talks to Lady Bird, and he says he wants to talk to Lyndon, please. Now Lyndon was asleep, and if it was anybody else, she would say, he's sleeping, I don't want to wake him. But this guy is going to be President of the United States, so Lady Bird goes in and she shakes him awake. She says, Jack Kennedy is on the phone. He wants to talk to you. So Lyndon rubs his eyes and he says, tell him I'll call him back in 10 minutes. I'm just getting up. And she tells him dutifully. And 10 minutes later, during these 10 minutes, he calls on the phone his protege. Remember, he's the protege. Johnson, is the protege. Where's that guy from Texas, the little old man who? Rayburn. Yeah, was the head of the House, the Speaker of the House. And Johnson was Rayburn's protege. Now Johnson calls his protege, who is Tom Connolly, the governor of Texas. And he says, John, JFK was on the phone a little while ago, and he wants to see me. I think he's going to offer me to be the vice presidential nominee on his ticket. What do you think I should do? And Tom Connolly, who was John Connolly, right. There was a Tom Connolly from Texas in the generation before, unrelated to this Connolly. Yeah, so John Connolly said, what do you want that for? You got all the power you can have other than the President of the United States when you are the head of the Senate. That's the second most powerful office in the country. Nothing gets elected, nothing gets done unless you say so. You got all the power. Well, you know the vice presidency has no power. All you're going to do is be the president's prat boy. He says, yeah, but I might also be the president. It reminds him that John Kennedy has Addison's disease, and he just may not be around very long. Huh? And I have no other way to get to be president but that way. So I'm going to take it if he offers it. So the president, no, John Kennedy wasn't president yet. The presidential nominee goes down the stairs in the back way so that nobody could see where he's going and make camp outside his door or anything like that. They use those back stairs. And both of them, their suites were near the back stairs. So here comes Jack Kennedy to Johnson's suite. And Lady Bird lets him in, and the two men sit down, and Johnson listens while Kennedy says that he wants him to be the Democratic nominee for the vice presidency, and he tells him why. He said, the reason I want you to be the vice presidential nominee is because I cannot win this next election without Texas in my column. And you are the only one who possibly can put Texas in my column. I'm not sure you can do it, but I know nobody else can do it. And that's why I want you to be the vice presidential nominee. And Johnson shrewdly invents a couple of things where he says, well, I'll do it if you make sure that you do this and so. I don't even remember. It wasn't even important. It's just that he wanted not to say, yeah, I'll take it. He wanted to put conditions there. So he invented the conditions, and the president said, you got it. He said, if I got it, you got it. So now, that's the deal they made. And now the phone rings, and Rayburn is on the phone. Is that his name? Rayburn, right? Yes. Yeah. Connolly had just called Rayburn to tell him what was going to occur. And Rayburn got on the phone trying to stop it from occurring. And he gives Johnson a lecture. And Johnson said, very sheepishly, because he really loved Rayburn, who had no family, and his only life was politics. And his protege was Johnson. And Johnson told him, I didn't have time to discuss it with you because Kennedy just popped in here and popped a question at me, and I accepted it. Rayburn had a fit, and he said, what do you need that for? You're giving up all the power and you're going to be a servant to the president. And just look now. Look now, who's our vice president today?
Biden.
Here, who's our vice president?
Joe Biden. Joe Biden.
Joe Biden.
Yeah, Joe Biden. Just think of Joe Biden in the last few months. You can't find the guy. He has nothing to do until the president gives him something to do. Take this trip, or go there, or go there, do this, be the messenger boy. And he was doing very well, publicity-wise, for a long time. But I can't find his name in the newspaper for the last 3 months. And this is what Johnson was facing. He said, yeah, well, don't worry about it. Power is where power goes, he said. Every job I ever had, I left 2 years later, and I left it much more powerful than it was when I got there. That's my specialty. Making myself absolutely necessary to the next step up and making the job I had be much more powerful. There are many more employees in that department. There's a much bigger budget in that department, and that's what I do in every job. And I'm not going to sit still when I'm vice president either. That's why I took the job. That's not why he took the job. He took the job because it's the only way to be president. Now, he didn't have anything to do with the conspiracy. He didn't do anything to Kennedy. He had nothing to do with it, supposedly. But he knew that there's a possibility that Kennedy would be too ill one way or another, or may even pass away. He once got his staff together as before he was vice president, and he said, I need you guys to get some information for me. There was no Google in those days. He could have got this that he got from them, each of them doing research in 5 minutes with Google, but it wasn't there. So these guys set about, they went to the library across the way, and he asked them before he sent them to the library, did I cover this before? I don't think so. He wanted to know from them how many vice presidents became president. Anybody want to guess? How many vice presidents became president?
8.
8.
Well, it was something like 7 or 8. I think it was 7. But how did they become president? Only one by assassination. 2 others by dying in office. And one because the president was so sick, even though he was alive, that he was doing the president's work as the vice president. So that was 4 guys out of the 7 or 8 that actually became president one way or another. And only one by assassination, so he's not figuring on assassinations, but that's part of the odds. So it was only 3 or 4 to 1 against him. That's not big odds. That can happen. And it did. And that's how he got to be president. And that's what he was thinking about. Where am I here? Not far to go. And I think this is about where I can stop. Anyway, you could see what kind of a guy Johnson was. You could see it every time I talk about him. He was a no-good son of a bitch, and he was an angel. He pays you money and he takes your choice. Okay, next week, Donald is going to speak on why the Middle East looks the way it does on the map. And that should be very, very interesting. And that will be our last lecture. And in November, we'll pick up with all the others and LBJ again. Nice to see you. Have a good vacation. Thank you very, very much.